The glass of the office window exploded inward like a confession. Shards scattered across Enzo Moretti's desk, slicing through the ledger where his debts were recorded in neat, cruel ink. Sophia was on her knees at his feet, lungs burning, hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and some other sticky thing. And before Enzo could rise, the little girl shoved her small, shaking hand into his and said, without preamble, "Don't go to the warehouse. They're speaking Russian. They're not guards." The words landed in the room like a gunshot, loud enough to be heard, strange enough to be disbelieved, true enough to make fear bloom under Enzo's ribs. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Sophia's voice trembled but did not break. She straightened, inches shorter than a chair, and folded her fingers around the cuff of Enzo's suit sleeve, as if it were the last anchor she had. Enzo heard the syllables again, remembered how she had learned them from repeating the lullabies the sailors used to croon on the docks where her father had worked. He knew a child's mouth could be a weapon, could be honesty or poison, and that question hung in the air heavier than the winter fog rolling off the harbor. "Who are they, Sophia?" Luca asked before Enzo could. His voice was calm, the flat, precise tone of a man who had once taken statements and now catalogued threats. He sat 2 chairs away from Enzo's desk and watched the girl as if she were a fissure beneath concrete. Luca had the look of someone who had stepped too close to fire once and kept his face impossible to read since. He had no illusions about what kind of chaos could erupt from a single misstep. Sophia glanced between them, the 2 adults who had become her separate kinds of refuge, and thought faster than the room wanted to allow. "They came 2 nights ago. They talk when they think no one listens. I heard Straicha, meeting, and they say the name Pellegrini like it's a new flag, the one with the scar." Her eyes widened. "They say they'll be with us tomorrow night." Enzo's knuckles went white on the arm of his chair. He had been awake at odd hours lately, inventorying losses like a man who counted the coins left in his heart. The Moretti house ran on a brittle code: loyalty paid in blood, debts settled with silence, and children, survivors like Sophia, collected like curiosities and kept with extra care. A warehouse meeting was routine enough to be mundane. It was the sudden hush and the foreign cadence that twisted routine into trap. Enzo's breath made a small fog between the ledger and his jaw. He had killers for eavesdroppers, and traitors had faces he would recognize, but the world had shifted. Outsiders now wore his colors in the form of paid protection. Luca nodded once. "Russian accents," he said. He folded his hands and let the words sit. "It means someone is meddling with alliances, or someone wants us to think so." Sophia's fingers tightened. "They spoke about the docks, and they said they'd bring a man who could make the old family bleed. They laugh when they say it, like a party." For a second, a shadow crossed her face, an adult's memory behind a child's eyes. And all at once, both men felt the danger with a child's clarity, immediate, intimate, and awful. Enzo had 100 ways to answer danger. He also had 1,000 reasons to refuse being moved by a child. Publicly, he was a ledger and a bullet. Privately, he was a man who had watched the dead come home in boxes with his name signed at the top. Sophia had been left in his doorway by a courier who had been dropped too soon between rival families. The dead man's last package had been nothing but a photograph and a promise to a sleeping child that someone would keep her. Enzo had taken her in without announcing it. The fact of her existence was written into his life like a soft margin against the hard type of his name. "You overheard them in the corridor?" Enzo asked now, his voice the low rumble that had pushed men to obedience and women to fear. "They were supposed to be guarding me," Sophia said. She said it like a hurt talisman. They wore black, and one of them had a scar on his cheek like a moon. They thought I was asleep. I hid behind the boiler. The image came with the kind of detail that meant truth. Calluses on the pipes, her small knees bruised from crawling. They gave each other a lighter. The flame was tiny, but they used it to read a paper with numbers. They said Streccia and tomorrow and Pellegrini. Enzo's mind began cataloging. Pellegrini, Riccardo Pellegrini, a rising rival who had been patient as winter and as hungry as fire. Bombs of loyalty planted like wolves in sheepskin. A Russian syndicate that had started buying protection on the outskirts of his territory. Each of those names created a map of possible betrayals. He could imagine, with a cold clarity, a warehouse room full of men who believed themselves to be charlatans and saints both, who believed that they were the rightful hands to take Moretti holdings. He imagined Luca's former colleagues being used like currency. He imagined red teeth of a coup closing. "Why did you tell me and not Captain Giuliani?" Luca asked after a moment, voice shaded with the memory of handcuffs. He had once trusted paperwork over instinct, enforcement over mercy, until the enforcement had turned its face away. Sophia blinked up at him, and for the first time, the room felt like more than business. "Because you are the one who watches him," she said. "You know when he remembers things that happened before. You keep his ledger." The child's logic was stripped of rhythm, but she said what she believed. Enzo needed them both, differently. You are the one who listens to the quiet. Enzo let out a soft sound that could have been a laugh or a breath breaking. He imagined giving orders. Sweep the corridors, frisk the men, find the lighter, find the signatures at the bottom of that paper. But orders were a loudness that might drown a warning, and Sophia's breath still smelled of harbor salt and smoke, and he could not move as if her urgency were convenient. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, the fractured panes clinking like a bell. The city spread out below, ware-hares roofs, rusted cranes, water reflecting a moon that didn't care who ruled the city. He thought of his father on the dock, thinking blood meant honor, and of his own hands, scarred by crates and contracts and men who learned to keep their mouths shut. He thought of the ledger on his desk, with names that were not mere ink. He thought of the child who had replaced paperwork with something like a prayer. "All right," he said finally, and the single word was the kind that men follow. "We'll hold the meeting somewhere else." Luca's eyes sharpened. We? He could have meant many things. An authority called by habit, a skepticism that existed between duty and affection, or the simple fact that Enzo had just invited complication. "We have rules, Enzo. Moving a meeting because a child overhears whispers." "It was not just whispers," Enzo said. He turned and looked at Sophia. "You heard names. You heard of Streccia. You heard Pellegrini." Her eyebrows knit, odd for a child who had been bred to hide pain. "Pellegrini is the one who sent men to burn my father's motor." Her voice dipped to a memory. He laughed. The room seemed to shift, because memories like that are heavy and have a resonance that summons consequences. Luca put his palms together, then separated them again. "If Pellegrini is behind this," he said, "it complicates everything. He has deep pockets, more than he should at his age, and he's making new friends. Russians are not the kind who like to share. They show up and stay until they own what you thought was yours, and he's not subtle." Enzo folded his thumb against the ledger. He had options. He had always had options. He could call his men and storm whatever meeting Pellegrini planned. He could send a message with blood and make Pellegrini learn the hard way the cost of encroachment. He could do all the old things, savage, efficient, certain. But something in Enzo pulled him back. The idea that his world was changing hands, and that children like Sophia had only the brittle shelter of his suits, and the brittle promises of men who had been too late to save others like her. "First," he said slowly, feeling each word like a step across ice, "we find who those guards answer to. We trace their wages. We follow their paper trail. We don't move the meeting if the meeting doesn't need moving. The city will talk, so will their shadows. And Luca, no one tells me what to think of a child's warning unless they want to tell me what they fear." Luca let out a noise that might have been a snort. "You don't need me to tell you when you're stubborn, Enzo. But if this is a trap, if Pellegrini brings a new syndicate inside our doors, we will lose more than a warehouse. We will lose faith." Enzo swallowed and looked down at Sofia, the girl who had become the most dangerous thing in his life, because she could ask him to use mercy and make it look like policy. "Faith," Enzo echoed, "is a luxury I cannot afford to spend carelessly." Sofia watched them argue with the patience of tiny animals who know how to wait storms. When the men's voices dropped into plans and lists, she fidgeted toward Luca, eyes bright with a child's unvarnished courage. "I can show you where they whispered," she said. "I can point them out. Please, don't let him go to the warehouse." Her pleading was a small hunger. It altered things. It forced Enzo to weigh more than ledger and territory. It demanded that he account for what he would protect if territory had to be bartered away. Luca saw the decision in Enzo's face, the brief flutter of a man choosing between a beaten path and a new one. And he understood, as deeply as a man could understand, that Enzo Moretti's empire had never been about the warehouses alone. It was a shield, and the people beneath it were the real currency. Outside, a foghorn moaned, and the city breathed like a living thing. Inside, decisions were beginning to congeal into tactics. Enzo paced once, finally, with a hand to his temple, and said, "We will watch. We will test. If it's a bluff, I'll make sure Pellegrini remembers the taste of shame. If it isn't, then we will owe this little one more than words." Sofia's cheeks flushed at the idea of owing anything to a capo with suits like armor. She had been taught to owe nothing, to keep her owing as quiet as the prayers her father had mouthed. Yet, as she looked at Enzo, she saw a softness she had not seen written in any ledger. An old grief, perhaps, or a promise. It was not enough to save a world, but it might be enough to save a night. Enzo's decision was a hinge. He could ignore a child and keep his empire intact by the old rules, or he could let the hint of a tenderness change the course of his hand. Luca watched him like a man watching the last piece on a chessboard. Either way, the city outside was gearing up to move, and men who wore new faces were already counting possibilities. By the time the smoking opinion of guards and the rust of the harbor had settled into a plan, Enzo had made a choice. They would not send him to the warehouse tomorrow. But choosing to stay away was only the beginning. The real question, now sharpened like a blade, was whether they could find the whisperers before the whisper grew into a roar that would make their world impossible to sew back together. Sofia slept that night in a chair by Enzo's desk, head bowed against the ledger as if to memorize names she would never need to know, only she might need them. Enzo lingered at the doorway, watching the small rise and fall of her chest, the improbable luxury of thinking a child might believe in safety. Luca stood a few paces back, and in that moment, between the two men who kept the city's sums, Sofia's warning had tilted the balance. She had no idea what she had started. She only knew the one person whose life she could not afford to lose. The dilemma, once simple and protectable by muscle and muscle alone, had metastasized into a question of trust that the ledger could not answer. They woke to a city that smelled of diesel and old rain. the warehouse roofs like open palms catching whatever spilled from the sky. Enzo's men moved with the precise slowness of predators who preferred to be mistaken for shadows. In the morning light, Sophia's smallness read as defiance. She picked at a scab on her knee and watched the men as if studying constellations. Enzo convened the few he trusted inside a back room that smelled of cigars and iron. Luca, two lieutenants with faces creased by work and bad luck, and Mara, his intelligence, part groomer of information, part merciful interrogator. Her hair was short and practical, her loyalty was sharper than most men's knives. "We'll start with wages," Mara said, voice clipped. "Find who's on payroll, who's new. If the Russian rumor is true, you'll see it in the transfers. They don't trust cash the same way our boys do. Pull the archives for last month and go forward." Luca folded the dossier in his hands. "I'll check the docs." Old habits die loud. If someone's bringing in new faces, the workers'll notice. The Pellegrini men smell like bravado, young, reckless. But Russians bring patience and calculators. We'll find the margin where they try to hide the interest. Enzo watched them both and felt the old machinery of his life click into place. Orders slid through his skull with the same ease as a prayer habit. Yet beneath the motion, he felt the tug of something softer, the idea that a child had rearranged the agenda. He wondered, briefly and with a foreign kind of fear, what else she could change if she were allowed to keep talking. They began with the payrolls. It was a small administrative hunt for ghosts, numbers that meant mouths and safe houses, ledgers that were more than ink but less than truth. Mara moved like a surgeon among them, her fingers tracing wire transfers, her lips shaping names like talismans. She found an entry. They were all the same name on paper. Stoyanov Logistics, an innocuous front, newly minted, channeling small sums through shell accounts. The wire trail snaked into accounts linked to a warehouse on the periphery of Pellegrini's operations. Stoyanov, Enzo repeated. The syllables tasted foreign in his mouth. Russian. The name fits with the child's ears. Fits and burns, Luca said. They're laundering muscle for someone who wants to hide under an accent in a checkbook. Pellegrini's pockets are deep because he's trading favors with outsiders. If he's bringing in Stoyanov, he's not looking to negotiate. He's looking to buy a siege. They sent scouts, two careful men who would notice the slant of shoes as much as gunmetal. The men crept to the warehouse on the map and watched the comings and goings like priests at a shrine. It was small at first, a van with tinted windows, men who spoke in low voices. But the scouts reported uniforms that didn't match the city's usual colors, accents that refused to belong. Enzo felt the old rage. Territory violated at the edge where he hadn't seen it coming, and beneath that anger, another thing, the fear that his decisions could cost Sophie's life tonight. "You want me to take her somewhere safer?" Luca asked once that night, voice hollow with worry. "Away from the warehouse? Away from pirates in suits?" Enzo shook his head. The idea of exile for a child felt like surrender. He had carved his territory out of dirt and blood. He had built walls not only against other families, but against the possibility of tender mistakes. Sending Sophie away would be to confine her to the kindness of someone else, and in Enzo's ledger, kindness was never guaranteed. "She stays," he said, "near enough that we can hear a lie, but not so close that she becomes leverage. And Mara, no one outside of this room knows she exists. Not Pellegrini, not Stoyanov." Luca studied Enzo, the way a man watches a pendulum and tries to predict its swing. "You're making decisions like a man who has already surrendered something," he said finally. Enzo's jaw tightened. "I'm making decisions like a man with a child in his care." The next day, they forced the trap to reveal itself. Enzo ordered a staged light shipment from Pellegrini's claimed suppliers, a baited morsel that smelled of weakness. If Pellegrini struck to claim it, they would see his hand. If Stoyanov tried to muscle in, they would know whose payroll the men answered. The city hummed around them while they arranged their chess pieces. Men in unmarked coats, drivers with false manifests, a van that was meant to look like a prize. Sofia, meanwhile, refused to hide. She shadowed Luca at a distance, learned his small gestures, how he adjusted his watch when a plan was about to unhinge. She sat on the curb and let the harbor swallow the afternoon and all its quiet. Children learned where to be invisible, and she had learned well. But invisible didn't mean unimportant. She had a small face that betrayed nothing and a set of ears that were unforgivingly curious. When the baited shipment rolled past the pier, so did Pellegrini's men. Obvious, loud, cruel in a way that made the gulls scatter. The first contact was messy. A Pellegrini lieutenant, think thin and new, stepped out to inspect the manifest and found instead a set of men who had come to propose an alliance. The talk was schoolyard and sharp, promises without cost, and a foreign accent that made the words slippery. Pellegrini's lieutenant laughed and mocked the driver for his poor ink on the logbook. The laughter was like an ember. Somewhere, a plan began to catch. Enzo watched through the binocular slits in the back of the building, his chest a harness tight with restraint. Luca was beside him, taut. The staged shipment was a ploy, but the men in the van were not all actors. One of them slipped a phone call mid-barrel, and the voice on the other end gave orders that sounded like definitions of war. "They're not interested in temporary work," Luca muttered. "Look at the way they arrange the crates. They plan for permanence." The first crack came when one of Pellegrini's men reached for a name, Enzo's name, careless as a child taking a toy. The van's driver, an actor in their little play, slapped his palm and said something that set the wrong rhythm. The laughter that followed was wrong. It was a bite. And then Stoyanov men slid from the late fog as if they had been part of the city itself all along. Solid, blank-faced, precise. A fight erupted like lightning, fast, hot, without the honor of a duel. Men moved with practiced brutality. The staged shipment became immediate flesh and noise. A gun rose like a twig, a man dropped like a bell. It was ugly, the kind of thing Enzo had avoided by not being a young man anymore, by choosing instead a careful brutality that was surgical. Now, in the wet light of the pier, brutality returned to its older, more animal shape. Sofia was closer than anyone would have wanted. She crouched behind a stack of crates, watching with a frayed mixture of horror and fascination, lips moving as if counting the seconds until something could be labeled and tucked away. The sight of men he loved and men he ought to hate overlapping in the same field made something in her small ribs hurt in a way she hadn't yet learned to name. Luca grabbed her when a stray hand flung a crate too near. He pulled her back, voice sharp as a razor. "Stay down, breathe, not a sound." She obeyed. Children in cities like this learn the art of obedience fast when the stakes are lungs and heat. But obedience does not end curiosity. From her safe hollow between Luca's elbows and a damp crate, she watched the faces of the Stoyanov men. One of them had a scar that curved like a moon. Sofia's breath hitched. The moon-scarred man looked at her, eyes like glass that had never known warmth, and for a second, one terrifying, luminous second, he smiled, as if recognizing a familiar knot of rope. The gunfire stopped with a single shot from an enemy back. For a moment, it was a painting of breathless silence. Then men began to scream in a language that stitched foreign vowels to furious teeth. Pellegrini's lieutenant bit his own hand in rage. The Stoyanov men gathered like a tide, efficient and quiet as accountants. They were not here to play. They had come to replace. Enzo moved then, heavy, certain, but not unthinkingly. He gave an order that folded the men like cards. Pull back, reassess, secure the perimeter. He was trying to salvage a plan gone sideways. He had wanted a warning, not a war. But war had come anyway, and they had to be ready to answer. When it was over, when the ambulance lights smeared the harbor with red and blue, and the moorings ached with the weight of the wounded, Enzo looked at Sofia. She had not wept, she had not cried out. Her small hands were dirty, her eyes bright and distant. She looked like a survivor's portrait made flesh. "You shouldn't be here," Lucas said, voice thin. "You weren't supposed to see this." Sofia's face was a map of old fortitudes. "I heard them," she said simply. Enzo's anger folded in on itself. "You were right," he said, and the words felt like sand in his mouth, coarse, unavoidable. "We miscalculated. Pellegrini doesn't come alone." It was a truth that did not comfort. The revelation sharpened into consequences. If Pellegrini was using Stoyanov, then he had the means to build a parallel muscle to Moretti's. Money, men, and a patience that could outlast men born into quick, dramatic strikes. Enzo understood, as if reading a ledger he'd always carried, that what had started as a whisper might be a siege in the making. That night, in the back room, lit by a single lamp and the jitter of a cheap cigarette, Enzo called for answers. He demanded names and receipts. He demanded truths that were not pretty. Men in the room shifted and spoke in half-collapsed sentences. Loyalties reneged, pockets eased by bribes. Men who had chosen comfort over loyalty. The betrayals came slow and then all at once, like a dam breaking. Mara handed Enzo a scrap of a roll-up accounting that smelled faintly of vodka and perfume. "This is the sort of signature they leave," she said. "Not their faces. Paper, numbers. Pellegrini funnels through Stoyanov. Stoyanov funnels through this man, Dimitrov." She tapped the name with a nail. "He's the one who buys men. He's the one Pellegrini trusts when he wants to make something permanent." Enzo's mouth was a tight line. "Find Dimitrov," he said. "Find Pellegrini's ledger. I want to know who signs his checks." Luca looked up for a heartbeat and met Enzo's eyes. "You're thinking of a strike." Enzo shook his head. "I'm thinking of an answer, not a strike. Not yet. If we strike too hard, we hand Pellegrini the moral high ground. He'll be the persecuted underdog with Russians at his shoulder and sympathy where we have none. We need to expose him slowly, make his friends thinly trusted, his benefit obvious. Make the city ask who's buying the loyalty." They worked through the night, rotating information like desperate men trading blankets. Outside, the harbor's tide moved as if unconcerned by paperwork and ruin. Inside, a different tide pulled. Names shifted places in the ledger. Men whispered of betrayals that smelled like old pennies and new liabilities. It became clear that Pellegrini had been playing a long game, buying protection, buying silence, buying the kind of complicity that could fester into ownership. Enzo felt the old anger come back in waves. For the men lost, for the child who had warned him, for the erosion of a life that he had thought to be solid. By dawn, their plan had a shape. They would not attack blindly. They would not be the villains of their own story through a rash reaction. Instead, they would gather proof, firm, legal-looking, impossible to dismiss, and make Pellegrini's allies visible. Make Dimitrov's payments public. Make the city's hungry eyes see the purchase. Sofia listened to this like a child listening to adults coloring their own grief. She had offered warning and received strategy in return. To her, strategy was a constellation of more dangerous possibilities. She had thought safety could be purchased by truth. Instead, she learned that truth demanded work, complicated, patient, prickly work that might take men to the edge of themselves. Luca saw the look in her eyes and felt an ache he could not name. He had once believed that doing right meant following rules. Enzo had taught him that doing right sometimes meant breaking them in secret. Now the two lessons braided into something that looked suspiciously like love for the fragile, the child, the city, the remnants of loyalty still alive inside men who were too old to change. They found Dimitrov's trail by the afternoon, a bank that handled transfers for a chain of front companies, a receptionist who cleaned her hands with lies, an accountant who had a weakness for silence and cigarettes. Every contact was a negotiation, a tiny theft of information through charm and menace. They collected enough paper to make a case that would not simply be whispered, it would be undeniable. When they left the office that evening, the city had shifted another tiny degree. Pellegrini still smiled like a man with too many plans. Stoyanov still moved like a shadow with its own gravity. But within Enzo's world, the tremor of a small girl's warning had grown into a weapon not of force but of exposure. He had taught his men to respect ledger lines like commandments. Now he was using them to protect something that had nothing to do with property lines, a child's trust. Sophia lay awake on the cot, thinking of the moon-shaped scar and the glass that had broken in the office the night she had run in. She had not intended to start a war. She had only intended to keep one life, one person who had been a strange, reluctant protector, safe. The reality was that her warning had become a lever. It had pried open old wounds and revealed the rot beneath. It had also introduced a new danger, that in proving herself right, she had painted a larger target. The tension of the impending confrontation pressed down on everyone like humidity. Enzo walked the thin shoreline of decisions and felt like a man balancing on the lip of something massive and inevitable. Luca prepared for the possibility that he would have to stand against the law he had once upheld. He rehearsed small betrayals in his head that might save more than paperwork ever could. Sophia practiced being brave like an instruction manual she had read and folded into the creases of her palms. When the night of the next meeting came, a meeting that Pellegrini insisted was just a parley, they did not send Enzo alone. He refused to be the silhouette of a man who would be easily baited. He refused to risk his face in a room of hungry mouths without foundations. Instead, he walked into the fog with a retinue. Quiet men, paper stacks, evidence wrapped like weapons. He carried in his coat a small bundle, pages that smelled like betrayal and tobacco, ready to lay skeletons where bodies had been expected. Sophia watched him go from the doorway, her small hands finding Enzo's sleeve for a heartbeat before she let go. "Come back," she whispered. Enzo paused. He did not smile the way men show weakness. He only looked at her with a weight that suggested there were questions too old for words. "Always," he said. It was a promise, the kind men give when their hands are full of ledgers and their hearts of old grief. As he disappeared into the smoke of the city's mouth, Luca and Sophia remained in the room that smelled of old victories and fresh calculation. Luca knelt to Sophia's height, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said, and his voice was strange, gentle in a way that made both of them unfamiliar. "You told the truth. That matters." Sophia nodded, as if truth were a coin she could hoard against future scarcity. She watched the streetlight swallow Enzo, and thought of all the ways grown men could break or be broken. The coming hours would test more than loyalty or cunning. They would test whether the fragile thing Enzo had allowed into his life could survive the claws of power. In the harbor, somewhere between the tide and silence, Pellegrini planned his next move. But now he planned against a different kind of enemy. A boss who had learned to listen to a child, a fixer who had learned to feel, and a city that was finally learning to see the ink that tied its fate to hands both foreign and familiar. The stakes had shifted from bricks and bays to promises and the small, luminous things people keep hidden in their pockets, the names they say at night, the children they swear to protect. The push and pull tightened like a corset. Enzo would have to choose the next step while keeping his ledger precise and his heart less so. Luca would have to decide if law or loyalty made him whole. Sofia had to reckon with the power of a warning that could unmake cities. They had drawn the lines. Now they would have to stand behind them, together or apart, as the city slowly learned the weight of a child's voice. The next morning smelled of iron and old rain, and something coppered that made Enzo's stomach drop. The report of a man with a bullet-shaped silence where laughter used to be. The proofs they'd gathered lay in a neat stack on Enzo's desk, paper like evidence and accusation, and, somewhere between them, a permission to act. But paper could be folded into ashes if men with pockets as deep as Pellegrini's chose to burn it. Enzo had learned that the world made choices between truth and survival by who held the torch. That afternoon, a face they thought untouchable stepped into the light. It arrived not in a gunshot, but in a rotten courtesy. Captain Giuliani, once Luca's partner in blue, now in a suit inked with taxes and compromise. His tie was too thin, his smile thinner. He came with the official gait of someone who still believed in the language of papers. An affidavit, a badge, a balance of favors. He came asking for a meeting with Enzo. "You called for me," he said, without ceremony, when Enzo dismissed waiters and closed the shuttered room. His eyes flicked to the papers like a man checking a bill. He had a politician's skin, polished by years of being expected to stand in between men and chaos. "We didn't," Enzo said, but his voice did not carry the surprise it usually would. "Sit." Giuliani sat like a man who had rehearsed humility. He glanced at Luca, at Sofia, at the papers. "I heard there was a skirmish at the pier," he said. "Unfortunate, tragic, but a law is a cumbersome instrument, Mr. Moretti. We drag our feet because we have to. We do not like blood on our hands, but sometimes, we cannot stop it." Sofia watched him with a child's instinct for measure. She'd once trusted uniforms. Her father had worn one before he was killed by a bus that never belonged to anyone. She had learned that uniforms could be stitched with mercy or with money. The seam that held it together was nearly invisible. "You're too comfortable with sometimes," Enzo said softly. "Who are you working for, Captain? Pellegrini? Dimitrov?" Giuliani's mouth tightened. "You're making accusations that will get you noticed in ways you don't want." He lowered his voice. "And you are not the only one who thinks he can run the city by ledger and fear, Mr. Moretti." There it was, the veiled suggestion that Enzo's ledger might be outdated, the insinuation that Giuliani could be a protector or predator, depending on the price. Luca's fingers clenched on the armrest. The old badge among them had become a currency of its own. "You forget," Luca said, voice brittle, "that you once thought law meant something." Giuliani's smile thinned into a small, dangerous line. "I remember everything, Luca. I also remember the bodies I had to ignore to keep larger collapses from happening. You don't imagine corruption is a betrayal so much as a necessary arrangement." The room went cold. Sofia's small body was a live coal between them. Enzo watched Giuliani and felt the ledger under his fingers, not a book as much as a species of promise. If the captain favored Pellegrini, then more than a warehouse was at risk. If Giuliani fed names to Pellegrini, the enemy could cut the roots out from under Moretti's house. The betrayal that would blossom from such a thing would not be small. It would be an earthquake. "You speak as if you can justify the dead," Enzo said. Whose wife do you think opens a door to a man because you calculate it's necessary to lose her husband? Giuliani's jaw worked. For a moment, something like regret softened the political armor. We are all balancing scales, Mr. Moretti. You would do the same. You think I would sell my people's lives for peace? Enzo's voice was not raised, but it carried the weight of a man who had buried more than promises. You think I would trade a child's safety for a ledger's neatness? Sophia surprised them both when she spoke, her voice small but steady. You have a ledger too, Captain. You just hide it under a different desk. The room snapped around that. Giuliani looked at the child as if he'd been struck. Luca's hand came down on the table like a verdict. Enzo felt that particular tenderness, the one where a child's plainness cuts through grown men's thickened excuses, and it made him want to break something and hold something else. Giuliani rose then, slowly, like a man aware he'd lost a wager. Be careful, all of you, he said. When you pull at threads tied to men who have government and money behind them, you might find people you once trusted. He paused. And people who once trusted you. Outside, the city took his words as if they were ordinary weather. Enzo closed the blinds and watched the sunlight grind into day. Betrayals that came from unexpected corners were the worst, the ones that smelled of comfortable hands and late dinners. Giuliani's departure left a residue, the understanding that some of their enemies wore uniforms and kept lists like sacred books. The first fracture came not from an enemy, but from within. That evening, a lieutenant named Adriano, long loyal, eyes too kind for the line he'd chosen, stumbled into Enzo's back room with a trembling hand and a face that had known better nights. He had a message, and he delivered it like a man confessing an old sin.
I owe Pellegrini money, Adriano said. His voice was thin, transparent. Years ago, I thought I could pay it back before it mattered. He used my guilt. He lent me money when I had nothing. He told me to be patient. He said he'd keep my name out of the storm if I made small favors. His fists worked in his pockets. He asked me to let a shipment go through the docks undisturbed. I said yes because I was afraid my family would starve. Luca's knuckles opened and closed. You were supposed to tell me. Adriano's face burned. I wanted to, but I kept thinking I'd fix it. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. He looked almost small. One bad decision, like a pebble that could start an avalanche. I swear I didn't know about Stoyanov. I only thought it would be smaller. The room filled with a different kind of silence, the one that follows when trust is revealed fragile. Enzo's anger was a slow burn. He'd forgiven things in the past because he believed he could teach men loyalty. Perhaps he'd been naive to think loyalty could be enforced without breaking. But Adriano's confession was the kind of thing that made consequences feel immediate. Men who owed favors to Pellegrini could be turned, could be bought, could become the thin edges of betrayal from inside. Enzo dismissed Adriano with a look that was neither wholly angry nor wholly merciful. You've made it worse, he said, but confessions help the living. Go home. Stay there. Do not go out after dusk until I say otherwise. Adriano left like someone who'd been told to exile himself. The second fracture came when Mara, sharp-eyed, silent-lipped, brought news of another kind. Two of Enzo's oldest informants, men who had been with him since the docks smelled like new paint, had been seen in a Pellegrini supper room, laughing as if their allegiance were a thing to be traded. One of them had kissed Pellegrini's hand. It's contamination, Mara said. It starts slow. A meal here, a favor there. And then the men who feed you begin to think they own you. Pellegrini's buying affection like it's a commodity. Luca slammed his fist on the table with a sound like a knuckle cracking. We bleed at the edges when we don't pay enough attention, he said. We assume our men are bound to us by fear. But sometimes, fear is fragile as a moth. Enzo felt something snap in his chest, something that had been holding him together and had been quietly melting for years. To find men he trusted laughing with the enemy was a betrayal, yes, but it was also an indictment of what he'd built. He had hoped the ledger would hold. Now he saw that ledgers do not account for hunger, for loneliness, for the soft ache of being left alone to choose. A third fracture was quieter, but worse. Someone had betrayed Sophia's existence. A note arrived on Enzo's desk that read, "The child's name is known." Enzo carried it like a stone to the trash and found his hand shaking. That someone, some traitor, some loose-tongued man, had taken a child's name and passed it to Pellegrini felt like a vileness that needed a fresh kind of vengeance. "Who?" Luca asked. The accusation was a spear thrown into the dark. Enzo didn't answer immediately. He thought of the way Sophia slept cradled against the ledger the night he'd decided they would not go to the warehouse. He thought of the fragile trust she'd given him, the kind of faith that is rarer than loyalty. He thought of Giuliani, of Adriano, of the men who'd kissed hands for a dinner and left living with their pockets lined. "We will find out," he said finally, and the words carried with them the cold edge of a man who had been forced to face what his protection actually meant. "And when we do, we will make them remember that children are not currency." Luca watched him with an expression that had become familiar, cautious, tired, and a little like a man who had seen a glimmering possibility of redemption and feared what the price would be. The fractures were many now, uniformed smiles, paid affections, named children, but the ache that knotted them together was simple. Enzo had promised protection, and the world had started to charge a toll. The men inside his house were beginning to peel away, each small betrayal a salt in the wound. That night, as fog rolled back over the harbor and lights blinked like hesitant stars, Sophia lay awake and listened to men argue in the next room. She understood betrayal in a way she had not named, not as an event, but as a slow untying of threads that had kept people together. She had warned to keep a life safe and found herself in the center of a map men had drawn in secrecy. When she finally slipped from her cot and padded to Enzo's door, she found him there, sleeves rolled, face rimmed in lamplight. He did not flinch when she came close. He sat and patted the space beside him, a stiff invitation, and she surprised them both by crawling into his lap like a tired thing and letting herself be held. Luca watched them from the doorway with something like pity and something like hope. "We're losing men," he said simply. "We have more traitors than I thought." Enzo closed his eyes and let the child against him be the damp cloth on a fevered brow. "Then we have to decide which of those men are worth saving," he said, "and which ones we let go so the rest can breathe." The decision was not easy. Each man lost was a memory and a risk and a potential blade in Pellegrini's pocket. But to keep every failing piece would be to invite collapse. Enzo's world had always been a constant calculation, and now the sums shifted like sand. He held Sophia and felt the weight of his obligations like the weight of an animal ready to shift its stance. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and hungry. Inside, friendships cracked and alliances turned brittle. The fractures were everywhere. In the laugh of a man who had once been loyal. In the salutation of a captain who wore compromise like perfume. In the ledger that smelled now of betrayal. The real danger was not the gunman at the pier. It was the slow erosion of trust that left them exposed like bone. Enzo had heard the little girl when she warned him. Now he had to hear her again. Hear the truth she had armed him with and the cost it would require. He thought of the ledger, of paper and promise, and of the small warm weight in his arms. He understood then that pretense of invulnerability had died the night the glass of his window had exploded.
He could rebuild walls, but he could not rebuild all the men who had once thought him unassailable. When dawn edged its way back into the harbor, the plan had changed. They would not merely track names and receipts. They would make Pellegrini's purchases public in quiet, surgical leaks, rumors that looked like facts. They would erode his foundation slowly, so that the city's eyes would look away from Enzo's ledger and toward Pellegrini's payments. It was a different kind of war, one that required patience and the brutal courage to let some men go. Enzo's hand tightened on his ledger, then softened as he stroked Sophia's hair. He would pay whatever price necessary to keep this child safe, even if it meant letting go of men he had once loved. And somewhere, in the smoky rooms and the gilded offices where Pellegrini and Dimitrov and Stoyanov plotted, the sound of a small girl's voice had begun to echo like a bell. It was a sound that would not let them sleep easy. The fractures had been revealed. Now, the healing or the destruction would have to begin. The warehouse doors groaned open like lungs about to be cut out, and Enzo stepped into the light because he knew there were some things you could not let happen in the dark. He had a folder of proofs under his arm, Dimitrov's transfers, receipts tied to Pellegrini's dinners, names written in a neat disapproval. And he walked into Pellegrini's parlor as if he owned the floorboards. The men who greeted him were fewer than he had expected and hungrier for spectacle. They circled with the arrogance of boys who had been taught to bite and not to break. Sophia had not been fooled. She clung to Luca's hand at the edge of the alley, a small, fierce anchor. Luca's jaw was set like iron, and his eyes kept roving until they found Enzo. There, lit, dangerous, beautiful in his recklessness. Sophia's warning had led them here. Now the truth would have to be the thing that saved them, or the thing that burned everything down. Enzo presented the papers like a dare. "You're buying men with foreign coin," he said, the ledger's weight on his chest making the words heavy. "You think you can purchase an invisible army and step over us into the city? Show me your receipts." Pellegrini smiled a smile a child would have called too clean. "Accusations, Mr. Moretti," he purred. "Documents without context are gossip. You'll need more than paper to shame me." Dimitrov, a gray-eyed man who smelled faintly of tobacco and contempt, stepped forward. "We were invited to think about peace," he said. "You brought a ledger and expected to start a war with a briefcase." Enzo folded the folder and pressed it to his heart. "I brought the truth," he said, "and the city will hear it." Pellegrini laughed and nearly turned the scene into a mockery of consequences. He reached for a bottle and raised it as if to toast. "Then let the city watch us make peace." The first gun, so small it was almost polite, sounded in the doorway. A warning, a signal. The room froze. Luca's hand tightened on Sophia as men moved like shadows, remembering their orders. Enzo's men were at the edges, quiet and precise. But there were too many hands, too many faces that might have been bought this morning with dinners and promises. Luca looked at Enzo for a fragment of a heartbeat, the world narrowing to 2 breaths. He had never expected to be the man who would bargain his soul for another. He had only meant to keep order and to atone for an old life of law. Now the atonement demanded more. He stepped forward and, with the economy of a man trained to read danger, cut Pellegrini's microphone cable and sent a flare into the air. A signal they had promised would bring Enzo's men if things tipped. For a moment, Pellegrini's composure flickered. He barked orders. Men moved. The warehouse became a map of sudden violence and clinging hope. Enzo saw the way the Stoyanov-hired muscle flanked the exits. He saw Dimitrov smile like a man who had considered all outcomes and liked them. Enzo could have left then, could have walked out with the folder and let the ledger work slowly in the city's courts.
But the ledger would not help a child who had already seen men die and learned the price of listening too late. Enzo thought of Sofia, of the wooden toy she had kept, of the way she had crawled into his lap when the world felt rough. He thought of Luca, steady and brittle and more vulnerable than the badge he'd once worn. He made a choice that resembled a bargain. Enzo threw his hands up like a man surrendering and let Pellegrini's lieutenants close in. "Take me," he said. "I'll go. Take me and leave the child out of this." The room inhaled.
Luca's face broke in half, fear on one side, a decision on the other. He should have moved to stop Enzo. The protocol was simple. Instead, he stepped in front of the man he had once sworn to arrest and placed himself between Enzo and the first reaching hand. "No," Luca said, voice low and absolute. "You don't get to trade him like merchandise." Pellegrini's amusements dimmed. He had expected bargaining chips, not men who preferred to break themselves into pieces rather than cut a child loose. He signaled, and a shot rang out. Not aimed at Enzo, but toward the rafters where a light rig had been loosened. Splinters rained. Someone screamed. The chaos became a river. Its current took men to the floor and others to the dark. Enzo moved like a man who knows the choreography of sacrifice. He had planned for many things, but tenderness was not a tactic. He pushed Luca aside from a swinging metal beam and took the blow instead. Metal found his shoulder like a blade, the sound a final, honest thing. The force knocked him against crates. He tasted iron, and the city spun with the loudness of his own breath. Sofia saw it all in a blink that would become memory. She launched herself forward, small and stupid and brave, and found Enzo slumped against a stack of boxes. Blood, bright as the harbor lights at dawn, painted a heart where ledger had been. Luca yelled, a sound that shredded something between both men, and then he was on Enzo like a man trying to hold together the only thing he loved. "Stay with me," Luca ordered, and there was no rank in that sentence, only a plea. He pressed fingers to wound, cursed in half-made languages, and looked at Enzo with an intensity that made the rest of the warehouse blur. Enzo's eyes found Luca's, open, wet at the rims, and for a suspended heartbeat, the city and its bargains fell away. "I can't," Enzo began, the word shredded by pain. He swallowed and tried again. "You don't have to." Luca cut him off by leaning forward and kissing him, rushed, desperate, unpolished, and true. It was not the polite press of men who keep secrets. It was an unmasked confession, a violent prayer. Around them, men kept fighting, orders were barked, and someone on the periphery made a radio call. But in that kiss there was a promise anchored deeper than transactions. Luca would keep him. Luca would choose him. In the press of that mouth and the warmth that followed, Enzo felt surrender, not as weakness, but as a kind of salvation. Sofia, knees scraped and heart thudding like a trapped bird, touched Enzo's hand. "You promised," she whispered, voice a bark of childlike command and faith. Enzo's laugh was a small, ragged thing. "I promised," he said. The ledger under his thoughts shifted its edges. Territory and ledgers would have to wait. There was a new account to balance now. A small girl who had spoken truth into a room full of lies, and a man who had found a reason to be less alone. They were not out of danger. The warehouse was still hostile, Pellegrini's men still calculating. But the kiss had changed the algebra. Luca's decision to risk the law and his life for Enzo moved something like a tide. Men watched a scene that humanized their boss, and seeing a man expose himself to love and pain made them hesitate in ways bullets had not. Someone on the periphery called off the dogs. Ambiguity became order. And in the hush that followed, the authorities that Pellegrini thought would be on his side were instead coaxed into paperwork, subpoenas, and delays by Enzo's men who had a different plan: to use the proof not to slaughter, but to reveal. Pellegrini's smirk thinned into anger as officers appeared, not the ones he expected to control, but others tipped by careful leak and loyal men who still believed the city could choose a better ledger.
Enzo's shoulder burned, but he blinked up at Luca and saw vulnerability there, a soft, terrifying answering flame. Luca's hand tightened around his, fingers digging into flesh. Ownership without claim, salvation without contract. "You will live," Luca said, voice raw. "You'll live, and then you'll explain to me every stupid decision you made, especially the ones I disagree with." Enzo smiled, small and feral. "I plan to," he rasped, "but not tonight. Tonight, we are alive." Sophia curled into the space between them, small and certain, as if she were the heart that made men brave. Around them, men moved to bind wounds, to keep the evidence safe, to shepherd the city's attention toward paper and away from bodies. Pellegrini's plan had frayed. Dimitrov's patience thinned. The moment had been bought with blood and a kiss, and the price had been paid by two men who had learned that redemption was less about absolution and more about the courage to claim one another in public. When the ambulance lights smeared through the warehouse windows like watercolor, Enzo let Luca lift him. He looked at the child he had sheltered with the fierce tenderness of a man who understood what true ownership meant. Luca's fingers brushed his cheek, gentle, final in that embedded way, and Enzo answered with the steadiness of a man newly unashamed. Outside, the city kept breathing. Inside, a rumor had begun to unspool. Moretti had been wounded, but not broken. He had been saved by a man who once wore a badge, and a little girl, small, wiry, stubborn, had the ears of a city now listening to her truth. They carried Enzo into the ambulance together, Luca's forearm going under his knees, Sophia's small hand on his wrist, and for the first time in a long while, the ledger on Enzo's desk fell open without the neat cruelty of debts. It fluttered like a heart waiting to be rewritten. The cost of the night would be paid in more than wounds. Names would be called, favors accounted, betrayals named. But a new account had begun. The account of a small, improbable family stitched out of people who had taken one another's wounds seriously. As the siren wailed and the harbor fog leaned in to listen, Luca whispered into Enzo's ear, not a plan, but a promise. "We survive," he said, "then we make it right, together." Enzo closed his eyes and let the world tilt. Between the hiss of pneumatic doors and the distant barking of men who arranged other plans, he held Luca's hand and felt a warmth he had not budgeted for. Sophia, kin and talisman, watched him with the certainty of someone who had learned how to save a life by speaking the truth. Outside, Pellegrini watched them leave and understood, too late, that the ledger he thought he could buy had already begun to rewrite itself with names that could not be purchased. Inside the ambulance, the three of them leaned together against the hum of engines, and for one brittle, fragile moment, redemption looked like a small, fierce household. Hands clasped, promises muttered, and the knowledge that love, messy, costly, defiant, would have to be the next strategy. They wheeled him into a room that smelled of antiseptic and lemon and the weary patience of people who had chosen to heal. Machines blinked like small constellations. Luca stayed the entire night at Enzo's side, sleeves rolled, fingers folded over the wound as if his touch could stitch the ledger in the man's ribs back together.
Sophia slept in a stiff chair, blanket tucked around her shoulders, a small hand clasped over a wooden soldier she had found in Enzo's office, a talisman for nights that still had teeth. Morning came soft as an apology. The city outside kept making its bargains and breaking them. Inside the hospital window, sunlight carved a path across linoleum like a promise. Enzo woke slowly, the edges of the world a little watercolor and his shoulder an old, honest pain. His first clear sight was Luca's face, tired, bruised with worry, utterly unflinching. The next was Sophia, rubbing sleep from her eyes with a thumb that still smelled faintly of harbor. "You were ridiculous," Luca said, voice rough with something like relief. It made both of them smile because the old languages of men, insults, orders, the clatter of bravado, were still theirs when tenderness arrived. Enzo tried to sit and found the motion hard and also necessary. "You were reckless," he answered, and the barter of accusations softened into laughter. It was an ugly, beautiful noise that sounded for them like an absolution neither had earned but both needed. Sophia climbed onto the bed like she belonged there, because she did, and leaned her small forehead against Enzo's chest where the bandages were heavy but the heart beneath them beat stubborn and alive. "You promised to always come back," she reminded him, the reminder like a coin placed on the table. "I promised," Enzo said, and in that word was a covenant that had nothing to do with territory. He looked at Luca and then at the child who had rewired a life with a single warning. "We'll keep you safe. We'll make the city listen." Outside, the news had already begun to move. Pellegrini's gatherings investigated, Dimitrov questioned. Captain Giuliani watched like a man who'd learned the taste of compromise might sour. Men who had laughed with the enemy found their dinners interrupted by subpoenas and public scrutiny. The slow, surgical erosion they had chosen, the reveal over the massacre, was doing its work. It would take time and patience, which was its own kind of violence, but the city's attention was a currency that could crowd out the corrupt. They rebuilt modestly. Enzo spent long hours in inked silence, reworking lists not to hoard power but to protect people. Luca made calls that resurrected old alliances and cut loose men who could not be trusted. He took no pleasure in the farewells. Sophia learned that truth could be a shield and also a burden. She learned to fold it gently. Nights were quieter. Mornings held new rituals. Coffee, ledger checks, Sophia teaching Luca how to tie a sailor's knot, the small domesticities that feel extravagant in a world used to counting only losses. Weeks later, when the harbor fog lightened to reveal cranes and honest work, Enzo walked with Luca and Sophia along the docks. The city did not become pure overnight. The ledgers still existed, and debts still had teeth. But the ledger on Enzo's desk now bore new entries, names written not as liabilities but as caretakers, promises that were paid in presence instead of silence. They stopped at a rusted pier where the water held reflections like a private night. Sophia ran ahead and threw her wooden soldier into the harbor, then laughed as Luca scooped it back up, smoothing its edges as if removing splinters could make loss permanent. Enzo watched them and felt, for the first time in a long while, an account balance that included something other than power. A small household built of promises, wounds, and the soft, stubborn practice of keeping each other. As they stood there, the capo, the fixer, the little girl who had altered the map with her ears, Enzo pulled Luca's hand into his. The gesture was no longer a transaction. It was a map to another kind of legacy, one written not in ink and threats, but in returned favors, in sleepless nights kept company, in a child's warning taken as gospel. The city sighed around them, indifferent and inevitable. But inside that harbor curve, beneath cranes and gulls and the endless counting of men, a different kind of ledger lay open. Names that would be spoken at breakfast, promises tended like plants, a small life enshrined not as asset, but as family. The wind carried the salt and a gull's call, and for a long moment Enzo let himself believe in endings that were not neat, but were, finally, human.